everyone, welcome to our much anticipated session in our series Ask Me Anything, hosted by Technology Networks. We are delighted to have you join us today. As the name suggests, this session provides you with a unique opportunity to ask our distinguished guests absolutely anything about their work, background, research, and innovations in their field. Before we begin, I would like to highlight a few important details. Firstly, this is a live session, and we're thrilled to have so many of you joining us. Many of you have already submitted your questions when you registered, and we really appreciate the support and interest in this session. However, don't worry if you haven't submitted your questions yet. There's still time, as you can add your questions during this live session. Simply enter your question into the box on the right-hand side of the screen and click send. Our virtual backstage team will ensure questions remain relevant, so feel free to keep them coming. We'll address as many questions as possible within our time today. While listening, feel free to explore the literature section on the platform where you'll find valuable resources from today's sponsor available for free download. If you experience any technical issues, just click the chat icon in the bottom right corner of your screen, and our team will be there to assist. And before we begin, don't forget to download your certificate of attendance for this session. We'd love to see you share it on LinkedIn and any other social media platforms. Our teams are always active on LinkedIn, so feel free to tag us. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce our expert, Dr. Ian Ross, a global PFAS practice lead at CDM Smith and a technical specialist for contaminated land assessment and PFAS decontamination. Ian, we've already had an incredible response from attendees, and we're thrilled to have such a large virtual audience with us today. To start, I'd love to ask, what initially sparked your interest in PFAS, and how did it lead you to your current work?
I think I got interested in this in 2005 when there was a large fire in London, and I saw the structure of some fluorosurfactants, and specifically PFAS, and realized that these molecules would be extremely persistent, and they were present in firefighting. So we were going to have a future issue with the potential for large plumes of fluorosurfactants. So it's, nearly 20 years ago since I first got into this.
Oh, wow. That's also a really interesting story for getting into something, seeing a really big fire, yeah. Okay, so for everyone that's joined us, can you explain what PFAS are and why they've gained so much attention in recent years?
Yeah, PFAS are a class of organofluorine compounds where, depending on the definition used, which changes depending on where you are in the world, you need a carbon that's it's saturated with fluorine. So that's a CF3 or a CF2 is the OECD definition. And there are slightly different definitions in the UK and in the States. But essentially, there are molecules that are all synthetic. There's nothing naturally occurring that's analogous. There are no naturally occurring compounds with carbons bonded to 2 fluorines or 3 fluorines. And what that chemistry does, it creates an extremely stable organic, which has been used in industry. Well, the first example I found is before World War II, we see synthetic dyes that were used in bulk quantities. So the interest started around the fluorosurfactants, PFOS, PFOA, and these have multiple uses like firefighting foams and metal plating and paper coatings. But they were restricted in the early 2000s, and since then there's been a whole host of alternatives that are manufactured, like perfluoroalkyl ethers. And you've gone from a C8 chemistry with an 8 carbon length chain, which are bioaccumulative in organisms and bioaccumulate, they're associated with protein, to shorter chains, but they're also equally persistent and more mobile, so more likely to be in drinking water. So we're now seeing Europe proposing bans on all PFAS based on an essential use. I think there's about 11 US states with proposals or enacted bans to restrict PFAS in certain uses, and mainly with the concern that PFAS are going to be around indefinitely. They're getting into the food chain and they're getting into drinking water, and so not using them for products where they're maybe not necessary, like cosmetics, is not the best use of resources, because if they do get into our drinking water, we're going to have to spend a lot of money removing them. So why don't we just only put them in products where they're absolutely essential?
No, that's completely, justified. Okay, so a great question has just come in. Ian, have you encountered any findings in your PFAS research that genuinely caught you off guard or had surprising implications?
Yeah, I think all the work we're doing on PFAS assemblies was unexpected, in that the higher concentrations of fluorosurfactants tend to accumulate with each other, and there's something called a fluorophilic effect where they sort of separate out in a separate phase, and that was unexpected. So we're still actually publishing on that, so I haven't got around to pulling a full summary of that together, but we've got a lot of research activity in that area.
Okay. Okay, we have a question about closed loop systems. Do you think a closed loop system where destruction technology returns treated effluent back to concentration technology is viable?
I do, but it depends which PFAS you're looking for. As if you're going to return PFAS back after concentration and you've not really realized they're there, then that may have an impact on your process. So, I mean, PFAS in a circular economy, one of the challenges Australia is grappling with. But as we start to realize there are maybe 2 orders of magnitude higher concentrations of ultra short PFAS around, and toxicological understanding increases, I think that's maybe going to impact what we do use for treatment in the future, because these molecules are highly mobile. So they can go through some treatment technologies like activated carbon.
Okay. With you just mentioning Australia, there's been recent news about Australia tightening PFAS guidelines for drinking water. Do you have any insights into similar efforts in other countries?
Well, I mean, the United States earlier this year brought drinking water standards down, where they proposed maximum contaminant levels at 4 nanograms per litre for PFOS and PFOA, and then a hazard index for others. And then in total, they're regulating 6 PFAS. But when Europe's regulating 20 PFAS under a sum, what I'm seeing, Canada's regulating, I think it's now 29 PFAS to be below 30 nanograms per litre as a sum. So it's moving in general to be more conservative, as in lower thresholds, and comprehensive to include more PFAS. But I think what we're seeing, 3 European countries have got drinking water standards for ultra shorts, the lowest being coming out of RIVM in the Netherlands at 2.2 ppb for trifluoroacetic acid. So I think as trifluoroacetic acid is a recent study showing it represents 2/3 of the PFAS in human blood, and it's potentially on the rise, then that's maybe going to be where regulations are going to focus as well.
About 2/3. Interesting. Many of our audience members are interested in industry practices. How are industrial companies balancing the need for PFAS in manufacturing with the environmental and health concerns? And can you share any examples?
I think you're going to be looking at alternative assessments, and then looking at exposure as well, in terms of the life cycle of the product as well. When it comes into using a product, where does it go after it's being used? And if you can justify there isn't an alternative, then I think continued use is likely. But there is a question there in terms of the availability of alternatives. We've seen microwavable popcorn bags that are loaded with PFAS, and in Denmark they banned them, and within a few months they'd found alternatives. So often bringing in regulations can lead to innovation, as opposed to claiming there aren't alternatives and then finding, well, actually there are. It's just they're manufactured by somebody else, so there's not a commercial incentive for the vendor to inform you of the alternative. I think a mixture of regulation and finding credible alternatives is the way forward.
Yeah, regulations are really important. So do you feel like there are key gaps in regulation at the moment that need immediate attention?
Yeah, I think there's got to be some understanding that there are usually more PFAS out there in, say, groundwater and other water bodies than we can detect. And I'm seeing this is where California's going. as far as using what we term non-targeted analysis to find PFAS. And I think it's more than it's how do you derive drinking water standards when you don't actually have the identity of each individual molecule or toxicological information on each individual molecule. That is where Canada's gone to set a standard based upon treatment. And that seems to be where some countries or areas are going, where you've got treatment-based regulations. If you can remove the PFAS, then please go ahead and do that without us necessarily having the identity of each individual molecule and a known toxicological understanding of it. That's where I'm seeing regulations going. Whether that's pragmatic and cost effective is another question, because with the bulk manufacture of so many molecules, I mean, if you use the OECD definition of PFAS, you'll find over 7 million individual molecules. I'm not saying all of those have been bulk manufactured, but we have a background level, we have ambient levels, but we've got to be pragmatic and understand that we're trying to reduce exposure, but at what cost, I think is the next question, because we've mass produced these chemicals since the early 1930s, so we are where we are, and we have to be protective of human health. But then, how much is that going to cost, and are you doing it in the wisest manner?
Yes. We've got a question from another member of the audience saying, what about PFAS in pharmaceutical products and packaging and also in cosmetics? Is there any regulation targeting these at the moment?
Well, the European regulations would be targeting all PFAS in all uses, and I think, pharmaceuticals, you would hope there's more of a toxicological understanding of their impact. Sometimes I think part of the challenges with PFAS is a lot of the molecules have organic components that aren't fluorinated, and these are subject to both abiotic and microbial attack in the environment, which means they transform to form common terminal products. So, for example, some pharmaceuticals may transform in the environment to produce trifluoroacetic acid, the same with a lot of agrochemical compounds. And so we end up with buildup of like just the perfluoroalkyl tail as the same molecule that is then regulated. You will end up with hundreds of potential sources of the same molecule, and then you've got to look at the toxicology of that molecule. So that's where I'd be with pharmaceuticals. And packaging, I think there are alternatives out there for just about every use. And cosmetics, I don't really think we needed PFAS in there to start with. So I don't think there's a use case. I mean, if you're using cosmetics, they get washed off in the shower, they end up in the sewage treatment plant. Are they just going to end up being put on farmers' fields and getting back into our food? There's that sort of reality of, where do they go? Or do they end up back in a surface water feature, which then feeds a groundwater supply, which then potentially feeds a drinking water supply? And are we just relying on dilution without this whole process? So there's a real question of where we use ultra persistent molecules and where they're absolutely needed and where there are alternatives that are credible.
Along the same lines, what is the best extraction or sample preparation method for detecting PFAS in food packaging? Are there any established regulations or methods you would recommend referring to?
Well, I mean, it depends what you want to find out about the PFAS, because there's no perfect silver bullet chemical analytical method for a group of this magnitude of compounds. So I'd look at what Alex Radwana's put out on extraction from food packaging. She did some work a few years ago to actually remove PFAS or find them. But then the targeted analytical suites may not capture the PFAS that are there, because they only have, I think some labs are getting up to 200 targets now. But the PFAS that are commonly used may be not in that list, so you wouldn't find them. There's a total oxidizable precursor assay, which can be useful, but I wouldn't say it's going to pick up absolutely everything. That should oxidize precursors, if it's done properly, through to the things we can detect. But I'd say we can't detect all of the terminal end products like the perfluoroalkyl phosphonates and some of the ethers. There's 19F nuclear magnetic resonance, which is very useful, as that will pick up carbon-fluorine bonds and give you a reflection of the vicinity of where they are in a molecule. Like, are they next to a carboxyl group? Are they central in a perfluoroalkyl chain? That can really get you a good idea of what's there. Then there's particle-induced gamma emission, which I think that's firing a proton at a sample and looking at the gamma coming off, which can be indicative of organofluorine or fluorine. And really, that doesn't give you any molecular identification. So if you want to do more of an understanding of what's actually there and get a molecular identification, we would say, high-resolution mass spectrometry, which is like an accurate mass, gives you 4 or 5 decimal places of an atomic mass unit for like a chromatographically amenable PFAS. So you've got to get it to come off a gas chromatograph or a liquid chromatograph. Then you can smash it up, work out how big the pieces are, and piece together what the molecule likely is. And these all have confidence limits, like published by Szymanski and Charbonnet, to indicate how confident you are you found what you found. And that can be backed up with 19F NMR. So this all gets expensive, is what I'm saying.
Yeah.
The way of doing this is combustion ion chromatography, which the US EPA has got a method out called 1621. And that basically you take your sample, you put it down a carbon cartridge, the organofluorine hopefully sticks to the carbon, then you burn the carbon and look at the HF coming off by converting it to fluoride, putting that down on an ion chromatogram. So that gives you a total organofluorine level. But it's not going to tell you if it's a PFAS either. You may have some organics that are fluorinated that aren't PFAS. There are a few naturally occurring organofluorine compounds, or there are some biodegradable, and AOS will take them up as well. So I think the bottom line here is it's complicated.
Yes.
Maybe you need to ask someone who's got some experience as to how to find PFAS to run through the complexities of it.
Okay. We've also had someone ask, how do you handle background PFAS when analyzing them at such low levels?
I think you're going to have some kind of trip blanks in the analytical method, but also go some distance from a site of interest and collect some PFAS from soil or groundwater, because we have volatile PFAS that come down in rain and can transform in the atmosphere or in the soil to the PFAS of regulatory interest at the moment, which are mostly the perfluoroalkyl acids, the terminal products. So, I think existing ambient is really going to be important to understand to differentiate that from what you found. But you can use all these forensic tools to help with that as well. Like if you're looking for straight versus branch chains, that can give you some idea of which manufacturing process was used. So there are multiple methods to do forensics, but none of these are cheap. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, I'm getting that. In terms of solid waste remediation for PFAS destruction, what are your thoughts on thermal destruction? Is thermal the best way forward? If not, are there other options?
Yeah, I think thermal needs 3 components. You need a temperature, you need time, and you need turbulence. So you need good mixing. And what we're seeing at the moment is most incinerators don't achieve a high enough temperature for full breakdown. And US EPA recommended looking for carbon tetrafluoride and hexafluoroethane a few years ago, and have brought out 3 methods to evaluate the success of thermal treatment. And that's OTM 45, 50, and 55 is just about to be published. So I go with these methods on stack emissions to check whether PFAS is breaking down, but also you'd be looking at the ashes coming off, and we've seen incinerator ash piles being sources of PFOS to groundwater. So yeah, thermal is a good approach if the temperature's hot enough. And for complete breakdown of carbon tetrafluoride, you're talking 1400 degrees C.
Okay, pretty high. So air transport of PFAS is much less discussed than water, but has the potential to carry PFAS contamination much further afield. Do you think that regulated or increased monitoring of PFAS in air would be a benefit to getting a full picture of exposure and spread?
I think the only place where air monitoring adds significantly to, I'd say in general, the only place, it's more, there are some publications on vapor intrusion, but I think we're in an early stage of understanding that. There's certainly emissions from fluorochemical manufacturing in air that may be significant, certainly emissions from landfills and wastewater treatment plants in air. As to whether they're significant is another question, of whether they're posing harm. But we're seeing another component of this in coastal locations with sea foams and sea spray aerosols coming from foams on a beach that are blowing inland. So we see a huge up concentration of PFAS because the fluorosurfactants stay on the surface of the ocean. They'll then foam up on the beach, and they can increase by 100,000-fold in the sea foams. But as the aerosolization of that process means there's usually a band around the coast that will have deposits of sea spray aerosols. So we may expect to see those aerosols being a focus, and certainly beaches in the Netherlands have been shut down as a result of, well, I would say shut down. They've asked that children don't play in the sea foam, let's put it that way, rather than shut down. So I'm seeing this as a potential issue where you're potentially going to have higher concentrations in soils. And in Denmark, the sea spray aerosol ingress into soil has meant they've shut hunting grounds down. So it gets into the meat of the game, and you can't hunt for game along the coast. So I'm expecting this to be more of a phenomena around the UK and other parts of the world with a lot of sea foam blowing inland. So that's where air would come in. I would be looking for the aerosols in air.
Yeah, thank you. That was a great answer. One of our audience members has asked, can you discuss differences in persistence and bioaccumulation between various PFAS compounds?
Yeah, I mean, there's not really a difference in persistence. What we find is the fluoroalkyl substances which have functional groups that aren't fluorinated and generally have some hydrogens in there, they're subject to microbial transformation. So they'll transform into a persistent daughter product. And the definition of persistence under REACH is really that the molecule itself doesn't degrade or transforms into persistent daughter products. So if you follow the OECD definition, the vast majority of PFAS will be extremely persistent. The bioaccumulation potential has historically looked at the chain length of the perfluoroalkyl acid. And so a C6 sulfonate like PFHXS has the longest human bioaccumulation half-life of around 9 to 10 years. And then PFOS has about 5 years, 4 to 5, and PFOA something similar. But then you get to these shorter chains like PFBS or PFHXA, and these don't accumulate in higher organisms to that great an extent. But these shorter chains, if they're in your drinking water and you drink them every day, you're still exposed. So it's just you don't excrete them. Well, they don't accumulate like the long chains in you from your drinking water. But if you're exposed to them in your drinking water every day, you're at a steady state, so you're still getting exposed. And that can be important for things like trifluoroacetic acid, which is usually present at a higher concentration than everything else. And there's, I think, more exposure to that individual molecule than any other PFAS, is my guess, based upon the papers we've seen so far, given the concentrations in drinking water around the world. It's, likely to be another challenge coming at us is how toxic is that molecule, and do we need to actually start thinking about removing it?
Yeah, I mean, talking about drinking water, for those wondering about home filtration, can PFAS be removed with something as simple as a Brita filter, or is specialized technology needed?
I'd expect the longer chains would be more effectively removed than the shorter chains, and the ultra short chains would likely go through. So the trifluoroacetic acid, no. The PFOS, PFOA, yes. And the PFBAs, PFBSs, maybe, but probably find that the filter doesn't last that long for the short chains and doesn't last hardly any time for the ultra shorts. The better way of removing all PFAS, if you're going to do it at home, is to get a reverse osmosis unit that you can fit under your sink, and then you are removing everything. But then are you eventually going to need a discharge permit, because you'll end up with a concentrate you're putting back to sewer. So I'm not sure if you're discharged and has to be treated. I don't think there are regulations on that yet.
No. Is it possible to fully destroy PFAS chemicals, and would methods like electrochemical degradation be effective?
There are loads of ways of destroying PFAS. Yeah, I mean, electrochemical is taking off because I think it's more effective. It seems to be better on degrading the longer chains and has a lot longer kinetics on the shorter chains. So you may need to run it for longer if you want to mineralize, and it's certainly possible. But I mean, there's ultrasound units are out there. Sonolysis has been working. There's plenty of universities working on that. And systems have been built at pilot scale in the US. There's cold plasma is working well. There's all sorts of technologies like supercritical water oxidation, hydrothermal alkali. I think that the challenge is having the PFAS in a high enough concentration for it to be economically viable to use these processes. So usually you need a process where you separate, concentrate, and then destroy. And so we've got loads of projects with different treatment trains, nanofiltration, foam fractionation, then hydrothermal alkali. You can put all these units together and make a treatment train of techniques, which on the same location will concentrate, well, separate, concentrate, and then destroy the PFAS that'll create fluoride as the main end product. It's all technically feasible. It's just again, what's the cost?
Yeah. It's all coming down to cost. So as an expert, have you had the opportunity to work on PFAS-related policy or regulatory initiatives?
Yeah, I think mainly we're doing quite a lot of support for the different regulators around the world on detecting PFAS at the moment. And historically, I've been feeding in on mainly the use of firefighting foams, and more recently, decontamination of fire suppression systems. So there's been a lot of regulatory engagement over that, with the fact that, as I was saying earlier, the surprising part of PFAS is they form very stable agglomerates that are more like liquid crystals, and these are on the inside of fire suppression systems. So we're providing quite a lot of regulatory advice at the moment internationally on how to assess and remove these structures, so you don't take your fluorinated firefighting foam out, think you've done some decontamination, or just do a water flush and put foam back in and find that there's a lot of PFAS comes back into your fluorine-free foam, meaning it's in Europe, potentially it would be classed as a C8 or a C6 foam and still be subject to regulations. Because we've seen ground PFAS come back into fluorine-free foam with just doing a water rinse. So it's that's where I'm being focused in the last couple of years, really, with regulators.
Mm-hmm. Are there any technologies or approaches being developed to remove PFAS from drinking water on a large scale?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, CDM Smith designs and installs huge water treatment systems. So yeah, I mean, there's some major activated carbon, major ion exchange systems we put in, and reverse osmosis plants. So yeah, it's since the first long-term health advisory came out from US EPA in 2016, there's been a huge need for PFAS treatment systems, and yeah, they're routinely being built and delivering water with PFAS removed. Well, the regulated PFAS anyway.
No, that's good to know. Are there ways to quantify waterborne PFAS without using expensive analytical instruments? Can absorption and photocatalysis features in providing decontamination solutions?
That was a convoluted question.
It was. Sorry, but I probably read it badly.
Measure them in water. Can we absorb them and use photocatalysis and decontamination? Yes. So it depends which ones you're focused in on. Yeah, you can absorb the fluorosurfactants, PFOS, PFOA, onto a solid, but maybe not the ultra shorts or the others as well. Photocatalysis, it's another one of these destructive technologies which is advancing, and it's a boron nitride approach. There's also some various photocatalytic units which depend upon irradiating aromatics which spew off a species called a solvated electron, and you'd be into a technology Denise K is moving forward at the moment, which is a destructive technique. So that is more of a photocatalytic mechanism. And there's a company in Minnesota doing the same, doing something similar. And there's also UV sulfite and UV iodide are approaches to destroy PFAS. So the next bit was decontamination. That's completely separate from waterborne destruction. Decontamination means you're trying to remove solid state PFAS from a surface. You're not in the aqueous phase. And for that, you need to consider that they're stuck on the surface in multiple layers, structures, and you need to remove them. And that we're finding is using a specific solvent. So we're just in the process of publishing 3 papers on this at the moment, showing what works and what doesn't. So there's definitely, that's a completely separate challenge for aqueous phase destruction.
Okay, thank you. How concerned about PFAS should the average person be?
I mean, in the grand scheme of things, there's a lot happening in the world. I'm personally more concerned about the collaboration of multiple large countries against NATO at the moment than PFAS. I mean, if you've got very high concentrations in your water, I'd be concerned. If you really want to eliminate exposure, then I would avoid eating fish and meat because the long chain will be concentrating in there. Certainly, Rainer Lochman's got some good publications out showing how much PFAS exposure is coming from fish. And then, cleaning out your water, getting a Brita filter, reverse osmosis, and then getting more educated on what products contain PFAS and then eliminating them from your life is also helpful. I mean, I would not buy microwavable popcorn and eat it because, if the bags are still containing PFAS, your popcorn's going to be loaded. I would check on which dishwasher rinse aids contain PFAS and avoid the ones that do. I think the ECOFA products look a bit better. But I think it's just getting more educated, like this car waxes contain PFAS. I would stop using those. So it's more what consumer products are out there and just making, informed choices if you're really concerned about exposure. Try and change your lifestyle to eliminate exposure as far as possible. But in reality, we've been mass producing 7 million different synthetic chemicals starting in the early 1930s. You can't ever completely eliminate exposure. It's just not going to be possible.
No. Do you think in the future commercial companies will try and say that they're PFAS free or make it easy, or there'll be regulations to more easily identify what has PFAS and what doesn't have PFAS?
Yeah, I think that's already happening. I mean, there's PFAS-free milk advertised in Maine in the States. And for a lot of products, I would then immediately ask, well, what's in it instead of PFAS? So we're moving to things like siloxanes, which look to offer similar risks. It's just they're not regulated yet. So it's always nice to see PFAS-free, but does that mean PFOS, PFOA? Does that mean you've checked for all potential PFAS? And then what are you using instead of PFAS? And is that another persistent organic or something else that will be regulated in drinking water? I think it's not as simple as saying PFAS free. It's what have you done? What's the product to mean that it's allegedly safer?
No, that's a very good answer. Can you share your insights on PFAS in relation to climate change? Do rising temperatures or extreme weather affect PFAS behavior?
Oh, I think there are a few issues here with, the potential that what I'm seeing from the fluorochemical industry is the positives of fluorochemicals in protective coatings for solar panels, etc. So I think there's some of our green technologies, my understanding is they require some form of PFAS. But there's also the life cycle of PFAS, and as we've just been talking about, thermal treatment and incineration. And the PFAS coming out of incinerators can be potent greenhouse gases. So there can also be a link there by all of our thermal treatment creating global warming gases, which is accelerating global warming. So I think there are multiple links. And we're also seeing refrigeration systems that are loaded with PFAS that get into the atmosphere and create trifluoroacetic acid. Now they've been classed as greenhouse gases as well, like HFOs, HFCs that replace CFCs. And we maybe need to be going back to about the 1830s when we were using carbon dioxide and ammonia, isopropane, and thinking about, well, can we be using non-halogenated, biodegradable materials for refrigeration systems, as I'm sure we're going to need more refrigeration systems and air conditioning. But yeah, so there's all sorts of links with global warming. But I'd say from the refrigeration perspective, what they've done is to try and eliminate the global warming risk. Some of the new refrigerant convert into trifluoroacetic acid, so we've got ppb levels coming down in rain. So it's
have you seen any recent technological innovations that have surprised you in their approach to detecting or mitigating PFAS?
I think there's some good test kits out there. That the FredSense technology looks interesting in Canada. It's more, with all the detection methods, you need something on site that can give you data quickly, and then you're into detection limits and specificity, as in, can you specifically pull out the regulated PFAS from something analogous like a perfluorooctyl sulfonamide? That's where you concentrate on using liquid chromatography. And then can you get anywhere near the drinking water standards with your detection limits? So yeah, it's really, I don't see a great on-site detection method. I think the use of AOF by California water boards, some forensics with NMR is really, really good and smart to find PFAS. For destruction, yeah, I think the generation of solvated electrons is looking pretty good with a few technologies like UV iodide and sulfite, and inspired solutions approach. Supercritical water is taking off, so they're all looking positive. It's just the sustainability and the energy usage of these techniques is a challenge. We're looking at hydrothermal as well, which is looking like it can convert sewage or firefighting foam concentrate to usable fuels as a process. So that's maybe a promising approach where you can destroy PFAS and still maintain the integrity of the material to use it again, as in you don't completely destroy all the organics to CO2.
Okay. Can you share an example of a significant policy change related to PFAS that you think could have wide-reaching effects?
Oh, I think the policy in Europe for elimination of PFAS based on non-essential uses is really going to have wide-reaching effects. And then that's moving across the states, state by state as well, with Minnesota, Maine, and now California potentially, but other states have got specific products that they're not allowing PFAS to be used within. So I think it depends on where you are in the world. I mean, this year in the States, we've seen circular regulations coming for Superfund. We're seeing, I suppose, more of an awareness of PFAS generally by regulators in multiple countries like China, Japan, and it's just becoming more of a concern that politicians start to look like they need to deal with.
Okay, so how do PFAS in indoor environments like dust and air compare to PFAS in outdoor contamination levels?
I need to find a specific publication on that, but I mean, the point I'd say with PFAS indoors is we've had stain-resistant coatings put on quite a lot of our indoor products, and historically, I think still continuing on, you can have people come round to put water repellent surfaces on your carpets or on your furniture, and so that brings into you're bringing PFAS into your house, and I think there will be publications that I can't put my finger on which will have looked at indoor dust and PFAS levels over time. So outdoor, it depends where you are, and what's the sources. So I'd say we've got a database of 10,000 PFAS journals. All I have to do is checking there, but off the top of my head, I can't remember who studied that.
No, that's fine. You don't have to remember a specific paper off the top of your head. If you could debunk one common misconception about PFAS, what would it be?
God. I think the main thing is the term is used in so many different arguments to say there's PFAS in food, or we need PFAS. And I think splitting things up would help. It's more the term itself. It's like a double-edged sword of we need to restrict PFAS without maybe understanding the full extent of the PFAS that are used. So there's some kind of, how do we split out and rationalize the commonalized term PFAS, which if it means 7 million different molecules, then if some of them are pharmaceuticals that are going to save my family's life, then I would say that's an essential use. And if some of them are in cosmetics, I would say, well, do we really need them? But we have this umbrella term, PFAS, and we've got to somehow split out within that the molecules that we're talking about in the use scenarios. I think that what we're seeing as well is that there's no real evidence that's been repeated of biodegradation of the fluoroalkyl acids. And so the term forever chemicals becomes contentious as in the environment, we're just not seeing microbes will attack these molecules. And I think even if we did find the odd organism that could start to nibble at one, the reality is these are fully oxidized organics that aren't going to be a food source for microorganisms anyway. Something bacteria could potentially breathe. So I just think, yeah, we've got a legacy that's indefinite of what we've produced. And that was sort of known since 1949 when Simons published this in Science. So, you know, it was called durability. And I'd agree we need materials that are durable, but not necessarily durable for the next few 100,000 years.
Do you think saying that they discovered this obviously in 1949, that they'd considered the impacts at that point?
I mean, the world of 1949 is a long time before the US EPA was set up in 1970. And Silent Spring was published by Rachel Carson, looking at DDT bioaccumulation and widespread crop spraying. So I think this all could have been foreseen, yes, but we're talking about a different time, and it's more with a lot of different issues, you know, with what we were doing in 1770 is different to what we're doing now, and it's a different attitude. So let's put it that way.
Mm-hmm. Mike, a second-year student, has asked, what advice would you give to aspiring PFAS researchers like himself?
Oh, I'd try and work out what's going to be most meaningful in the context of PFAS management and where you can assist with eliminating the most exposure and the most harm and rationalizing, or get into finding alternatives that are more environmentally friendly. And there's that question of if a molecule is biodegradable, is it going to function? Is it going to be strong enough to stand up to what the use scenario is? I'd get into alternatives. I'd be looking at cost-effective biological approaches to break PFAS down. But what we're mostly seeing is when you try the biology, they convert the less mobile precursors in the soil to the more mobile and regulated perfluoroalkyl acids. So I just get into the detail of how they behave, dive into the physical chemistry. They have peculiar behavioral properties, and I'd focus on that as well. It depends. I mean, there's so many various different areas of study within PFAS. It's hard to say what's more important.
Thank you. Someone has asked, if PFAS lasts forever in textiles and non-stick pans, what happens when they get to landfill? Is this regulated in any way? are people trying to reduce or manage how these types of materials are processed?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there are treatment processes going in for landfills to remove the regulated PFAS, like PFOS, PFOA, and a few of the other fluoroalkyl acids. So we're seeing some foam fractionation systems coming in. But, landfill leachate is usually highly anaerobic and a complex waste with lots of organics in it. So you're going to need a more robust treatment system that can eliminate PFAS in addition to handling the other organics. And a lot of the PFAS coming out of landfills are called fluorotellimer carboxylic acids, which aren't necessarily regulated in many places. 5,3 acid, I think that's now on US EPA 1633, and it's added to the DWI 48. So, it's more, there may be a whole host of PFAS coming out of landfills. And so if we focus on studying a few, like the longer chain fluorosurfactants, and we remove them with foam fractionation, are there more of the shorter chains coming out that we can't remove with that technology? And are we going to see regulations coming out to address those as well? So it's more, how do you deal with a chemical cocktail and try and eliminate the vast majority of them with a treatment process, when at the moment you maybe only be regulated on 1 or 2 molecules? But are you spending your money wisely by putting in a certain technology that just addresses those 2, when 3-5 years time you may be asked to address a whole host more?
Yeah. Another commenter said that they also work in PFAS and that this is really interesting and important session. Have you seen any impressive grassroots efforts or community-driven initiatives that have taken on PFAS issues?
I mean, mostly I see communities trying to get some compensation for exposure. And I'd say that's the Ronneby crowd in Sweden, as far as they've had 3 court cases, and the Swedish Supreme Court agreed that just having elevated levels of PFOS in their blood was equivalent to personal injury. So that would be the one community I would say has been fighting the longest on this issue. I mean, there are other organizations in the UK that are trying to eliminate PFAS from food. It was really good to see organizations looking at, putting a drop of olive oil on some food packaging and seeing if you can tell by the shape the oil makes as to whether it contains PFAS or not. That was an excellent little test that was developed. And I'm trying to remember the acronym of the name of the company or the organization in Scotland that did it. I can't remember. So I think, there's been a lot of activity where a simple test to identify PFAS can be helpful. We've seen regulators coming in and just restricting uses. We've seen Clean Product Action develop great guidance on firefighting foams. There's plenty of organizations globally that are looking for safer chemicals, ChemSec, etc., that are all working on this.
Similar to the climate change question, are there a lot of links between microplastics and PFAS?
Yeah, I think there's a concern that microplastics may be a vector for PFAS to start with. And then, so are some PFAS stuck on the outside of microplastics, and the microplastics is mobile? Then there's they were called high molecular weight fluoropolymers that were put into firefighting foams from the early 2000s that you could also describe as microplastics, and they'd be side chain fluoropolymers that may also be dispersing. So there's not been a lot of study done into those coming out of widespread dispersive uses of fluoropolymers. Then there are PFAS potentially within plastics, or there are fluoropolymers that are side chain that are used in multiple uses. I think multiple links depending upon a plastic polymer. Is that a polyethylene which has got some PFAS coating on it, as the US EPA found on the inside of some pesticide drums that have been fluorinated? There's several polymers that would be plastics that are PFAS containing. some would be classed as fluoropolymers, some side chain, and the side chain tend to release the monomeric like PFOA or PFHXA. So there are loads of links between.
This is another question from someone in the audience. Who has been a major influence on your career in environmental science, particularly in the area of PFAS, and what have you learned from them?
Oh, God. I mean, some of the academics in the States, I'd say, who've been doing this the longest, got a really good reputation. I mean, you're talking about, Jennifer Field, Chris Higgins, Ian Cousins in Sweden, Detlef Knappe, Rainer Lochmann. I think these people, Carla Ing, they're all working on PFAS. I do a lot of collaborative work with Jin Liu, who's just moved to Hong Kong, and Linda Lee in Purdue. So I think that mainly it's the academics who've been looking at this for the longest. Like I think Jennifer Field started like 25 years ago when they're examining firefighting training areas.
How do current PFAS testing methods vary between industrial sectors, and what drives these differences?
I mean, the test methods are usually driven by regulators, and they're country specific, and then they may be applied to different matrices or different industries. I wouldn't say that's specific from what I've seen.
Okay. What are we likely to see in the future of PFAS work?
I think we're likely to see a greater understanding of the PFAS that are out there because we've got more advanced analytical methods, and a greater potential requirement to remove PFAS from food and water. But then what we're going to need is the pragmatism to say, where do we spend our money in the most wisest place? Because, it looks from a level causing harm, or is it contributing to a background or ambient in the vapor phase, say, if whatever's off-gassing? It's really, we've got to try and look at sources, pathways, and receptors to be pragmatic as we move forward. We can spend a lot of money doing that much good, to be honest.
Okay. That's probably going to be one of the last questions as we're running out of time now. But are there areas? Oh no! How do PFAS chemicals influence soil quality, and what are the implications for agricultural regions?
Oh, I mean, by soil quality, I'm not sure exactly what that means. I mean, they certainly, if PFAS are in the soil, they can start to accumulate in crops, and that's specifically shorter chains get into the edible portion of the crops more. So I think we're seeing the longer chains stay more in the roots, and the shorter chains are in the shoots and fruits. But what I'm seeing with trifluoroacetic acid in wheat is like huge increases in concentration, like 1600-fold accumulation. So much higher than we see, like 40-fold for the other short chains. So I'd say that the soil part of this is more than the soil quality as well. What can you use that soil for? And are you going to be growing crops in it? And I don't think other soil quality parameters are that impacted by PFAS. It may be that moisture holding capacity has changed. If the PFAS are concentrated there, they're the wetting phase. If they formed a layer on the surface of the soil particles, and then water will flow through it faster. I think the major thing with soils as well is you can have a lot of cationic PFAS that are precursors stuck on soils, as we found around fire training areas, that you'd need specific analytical methods to both extract and measure them that are now commercially available. It's just when you move into soil, it's more the concern if you try to do soil washing, say, and you'd only looked at what the regulators are asking you to look for now, which is say PFOS, PFOA, and say the 48 molecules in the UK, you may have missed 99% of the PFAS that are present. You may think you've done treatment because you've shown data on a few PFAS, but you might move that soil somewhere else, and it starts bleeding PFAS to ground again. So because you've missed the precursors. And so PFAS are a lot more complicated, I would say. than other contaminants, just because there's so many of them, and a lot of the masks can be in the form of precursors with targeted analytical methods.
So this might be our last question from Subramanian. Is there any kind of HR mass database to screen PFAS, especially in Orbitrap mass spec?
Yeah, I think there's a NIST database that's out there that people are sharing. That's it's widely available. So if you try contacting Nick Gonda, he works for us in Denver. He's just published on 1633 methods. He can help you find the NIST database.
Okay. Okay, so unfortunately our time is now coming to an end, but it's been a fantastic session. Thank you for joining us today, Ian. It's been a pleasure speaking with you, and you obviously know your stuff. We've loved speaking with you, so thank you so much for your time. Thanks to everyone in our audience for participating and engaging. Before you go, don't forget to download your certificate of attendance. We'd love for you to share it on LinkedIn. Just tag us and we'll be thrilled to connect and engage with your posts. This AMA will now be made available on demand. So if you have friends, family, or colleagues who might be interested, please feel free to share the link with them. Once again, thank you all for your time and enthusiasm. We look forward to seeing you at future sessions.
Thank you.